What if the sheriff sworn to protect you was the same man who tried to silence you forever? Thrown from a frozen ridge, left for dead, one woman rose from the snow, not just to survive, but to ignite a movement. This isn't just a story of justice. It's the legend of a town that chose to see, to speak, and to stand. Stay with us, because once you hear her voice, you'll never forget it. In the depths of a merciless blizzard, the howl of wind through Cedar Grove turned sinister, like some ancient spirit wailing through the frozen trees. The eruption of a scream cut through the snowstorm, sharp, raw, and horrifying in its intensity. Not a gunshot, but the voice of a young woman thrown from a cliff's edge. That voice carried terror, defiance, and the raw pain of injustice. Lillian Carter, aged 18, lay sprawled on the jagged earth below, tangled in branches and buried moments beneath an unforgiving blanket of white. She refused his offer, she refused him, and in that refusal she condemned herself. Sheriff Boyd Mallory, towering and cold as the winter sky, turned to the swirling snow, face unreadable beneath his brimmed hat. The storm was nature's cloak, covering a crime no one in Cedar Grove dared acknowledge. Not yet. They watched him toss her off Mayhill Ridge's edge, drawn into the depths like a sacrifice, and yet no one stepped forward. No one dared break the silence. The wind carried her last gasps uphill, then swept them away. He stood there, stone-faced, as though enforcing a law only he understood. Deep in the marsh of his mind, that voice echoed, broken but defiant. Lillian had looked him in the eye, defiant, unyielding, when he offered her marriage as protection, as possession, something that should have felt like safety, but burned like betrayal in her heart and lungs. She said no, and so she fell. The wind chose his phrase, delivered by her trembling lips, "I deserve better." Then her silence. That refusal, rooted in courage and bound to consequence, marked Lillian and the town forever. Snow piled higher around her pale face like salt on a bleeding wound. The canyon's echo mocked the stillness. The townsfolk, bundled in their doorways and saloons, watched in silence. Reverend Santos stared from the church steps, his hand tightly clasping the collar of his coat. Marisol Carter, Lillian's mother, pined for tears she dared not shed. And yet no one made a sound, nor sought to rescue her. But help came anyway, from the last person anyone expected. Jeremiah Blackwood, a rugged loner living 3 miles upstream, heard the scream. He knew the mountain's secrets, the hidden paths carved by decades of snow. He dropped his axe, kicked open his cabin door, and charged into the storm. He found Lillian, cold and still, at the foot of the cliff, blanketed in ice, and he refused to leave her. With bone-deep strength, he carried her back toward civilization and a chance at justice. What compelled him? Not duty, not mercy alone, but something more. When Jeremiah hoisted Lillian into his arms, her closed eyelids fluttered at the strange warmth against her cheeks. He murmured her name, soft, urgent, alive, with a tremor in his voice that spoke of another life nearly lost. In that moment, the first flicker of hope began to radiate through the darkness. Not a blaze, but a tender spark. The breath of a rescued child, the first step off the cliff into safety, shattered the town's complacency. They might try to bury the story in snow, let the storm erase the traces, but Jeremiah's arms held a truth that wouldn't stay hidden. Lillian's refusal marked its deep roots. It shook the ground beneath every silent bystander, planted a seed of unrest in every heart that had watched and not acted. Lillian's sudden refusal, "I deserve better," became a beacon echoing through the silent valley. Not just a heroine's stand, but a reckoning. Wills clash, power demanded respect, and dignity cannot be bought. That single defiant phrase, as simple and powerful as the first note of a song, rippled outward, settling into the bones of Cedar Grove's oldest citizens and the youngest souls yet to be born. Even as Jeremiah raced through knee-high drifts, towing her to warmth and shelter, the town's hush grew shaky. Someone moved to close the saloon door. Someone else gripped their scarf tighter, fear and curiosity wrestling across their faces. What happens next? Who chooses justice over fear? Who stands with Lillian and who turns away? No fire could have burned hotter than her refusal. No avalanche more unstoppable than her courage. And in that frozen moment, with her young life trembling on the verge, Lillian Carter's last word, "no," became the most potent weapon anyone in Cedar Grove, and beyond, would ever hear. The world was quiet, too quiet. It was not the peaceful kind of quiet that wrapped itself around sleeping children or Sunday mornings. This was the silence after a scream, a silence thick with questions no one dared to ask. And in that silence, somewhere in a modest log cabin near the edge of Cedar Grove, Lillian Carter clung to life. Jeremiah Blackwood stood at the foot of the narrow cot, arms crossed, eyes heavy with worry. The lantern beside him flickered, casting golden shadow across Lillian's bruised face. She had not spoken since he'd pulled her from the snow, since he had felt her pulse, faint but present, beneath his fingertips. For 2 nights now, she had lain there, unmoving but breathing, her skin cold and marbled like porcelain left in frost. He hadn't left her side. Outside, the storm had passed, but inside him, another one raged. Jeremiah had seen war. He had known the smell of blood soaked into soil, the shouts of dying men echoing through trees. But nothing prepared him for this, for the violence done not in battle, but in betrayal, for the sight of an innocent woman, barely more than a girl, cast aside like a broken tool by a man who swore to protect the town. He had not needed to ask what happened. The bruises on Lillian's arms, the cut across her temple, the unmistakable shape of a boot print near where he found her. It told the story more clearly than words could. Sheriff Boyd Mallory had done this. The man who rode through Cedar Grove with the false calm of law and order had shown his true face. And yet, Lillian had survived. That alone was a kind of miracle. On the 3rd morning, she stirred. Jeremiah was brewing tea when he heard the faintest whisper, like wind brushing against pine. He turned sharply. Her eyes, bloodshot, glassy, were barely open, her lips cracked. "Water," she murmured. He was beside her in an instant, cradling her head, helping her sip from a tin cup. She gagged at first, then swallowed. Her eyes fluttered shut again, but this time not from pain, from exhaustion, from safety. "You're all right," he said quietly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're not alone anymore." Over the next several days he nursed her back from the brink. He made broth from venison and herbs, steeped tea with honey, helped her sit upright inch by inch. She didn't ask questions at first, she only listened. To the crackle of the fire, to his footsteps across the floor, to her own breathing. When she finally spoke again, her voice was no more than a thread. "Why me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a wooden chair beside her and sat, resting his arms on his knees. "Because you said no to the wrong man," he said flatly. "And because some men can't handle being told they don't own something, or someone." She nodded slowly, as if confirming what her body already knew. "He offered to marry me," she whispered, voice bitter with memory. "Said it would protect my family, keep us fed through winter. But I saw it in his eyes. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a prisoner." Jeremiah stared into the flames. He's done worse, I'm sure, but he never thought anyone would survive to tell it." She closed her eyes, the image of Mallory's face, twisted in rage, eyes like cold iron, still burning behind her eyelids. "He said no one would believe me, that I'd vanish like others." A long silence passed between them. Jeremiah took a deep breath. "He's wrong." When Lillian was strong enough to stand, she limped to the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her face was puffy, lips split, arms marked. But beneath it all, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. Fury. Not the wild kind, the kind that smolders. That shapes. "I'm going back," she said one morning, her voice clearer than it had been since the fall. Jeremiah turned from where he was sharpening a blade. "Not alone," he replied, not alone." That day they made plans. They mapped routes back into Cedar Grove, avoiding known patrols. They listed allies, people who might believe them. Jeremiah prepared letters to send with trusted writers, gathering testimony from women who'd left town, whispering names, patterns of silence. Lillian began writing everything. Every moment, every threat, every look. The first words in her journal read, "He thought I was his to destroy, but I belonged to no one." And slowly, through pain and ink, she began rebuilding herself. She slept better knowing someone believed her. She ate more, despite the taste of betrayal still lingering on her tongue. And she practiced speaking aloud again, not with fear, but with clarity. When the day came to return, she dressed in Jeremiah's old coat, heavy with wool and protection. Her ribs ached, her legs trembled, but her spine remained straight. They rode into Cedar Grove not like fugitives, but like witnesses bearing truth. The town's breath caught when they passed through. Doors creaked open. Eyes widened. The girl they'd buried in their silence had returned, and Sheriff Boyd Mallory watched from the courthouse steps, the color draining from his face. Lillian met his gaze. "I survived," she said to him, voice steady, and the town, once silent, once afraid, began to listen. In the pale light of morning, Lillian awoke to a quiet cabin filled with warm lamplight and the scent of pine. Her body protested. A deep ache coursed through her ribs with each breath, but even amid pain there bloomed a delicate sense of purpose. Beside her cot, Jeremiah Blackwood gently placed a steaming bowl of porridge. His eyes, both steady and kind, invited her back into the world, one soft spoonful at a time. "Take your time," he murmured. She managed a small nod. Each sip felt like a victory, a refusal to remain trapped in the shadow of the cliff. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm, though edged with fragility. "Thank you for not giving up on me." He set the bowl aside and traced a path through the floorboards with his boot. "You didn't give up on yourself. That counts for more than you know." The cabin fell silent, but in that quiet, Lillian felt a stirring of strength. She remembered every moment of the fall, its terror, its cold finality, but more importantly, she remembered Jeremiah's hands pulling her into light. His belief in her survival was no small gift. It was the foundation upon which purpose was growing. Over the next days, recovery became a slow ritual. Mornings were dedicated to gentle movement, lifting her arms an inch at a time, tracing swirls in the air with trembling fingers, clearing the haze that shadows leave behind. Jeremiah crafted makeshift splints and boiled healing herbs from the forest. Willow bark for pain, yarrow for inflammation. Each application of poultice, each whispered encouragement, planted seeds of resolve. One evening, as he patched a tear in her coat, she locked eyes with him. "I don't want just to recover," she said softly. "I want to rebuild something stronger. Jeremiah paused, needle in hand. He set it aside, leaning forward. Then that's what we'll do, step by step. And so they began. Lillian's journal, spilled with trembling anxiety at first, soon swelled with lists and names and strategies. She chronicled everything she remembered. Mallory's visits to widows' homes, hushed conversations between deputies in the saloon shadows, rumors of those who disappeared in late-night rides. Jeremiah added detail, tracks they found around her rescue site, inconsistencies in the sheriff's report. Together, they transformed trauma into documentation, memory becoming proof. Sometimes, tears washed over her as she wrote. But each tear was also fuel for the kind of courage that speaks not just for oneself, but for others who have been silenced. Jeremiah's presence made her words feel less fragile. He never interrupted, only listened. When the ache in her chest flared, he caught her gaze and reminded her, "You're doing more than surviving. You're preparing." By the time the snow began to melt outside, Lillian felt ready to return. Her steps still faltered, her breaths still caught, but the flame of purpose burned brighter than pain. Jeremiah fashioned a satchel for her. A bundle of letters, small samples of blood-stained cloth from her coat, and copies of her journal entries. He tucked a photograph into it, her face, waking after rescue, eyes fierce with new life. The morning they departed, they walked through the forest path to Cedar Grove. The thawed ground squelched beneath their boots. The first scents of spring, wet earth, budding pine, prioritized hope over fear. Each step toward the town staked a claim to truth. Entering Cedar Grove, they did not blend into the bustle. Heads turned. Windows cracked open. Whispers flickered through Main Street. Sheriff Boyd Mallory stood on the courthouse steps, posture rigid. His eyes locked onto Lillian's as they approached. For a moment, the world held its breath. She swallowed and raised her head. "I have come back with proof," she said quietly, but with undeniable clarity. Jeremiah stepped forward and placed the satchel on the courthouse railing. Mallory's voice cracked before he could control it. "You shouldn't have—" Lillian held up a fragment of her coat sleeve, still stained, still tattered. "I deserve to be heard," she replied. Her tone was quiet, but its power crackled across the plaza. She unrolled copies of her journal, one torn blood smear visible on each page. Then Jeremiah produced letters from other women, sent from beyond Cedar Grove, testimonies of fear, of forced submission, of hushed disappearances. The townsfolk watched, intrigued and uneasy. Elderly women in hoop skirts pressed together. Fathers clutched their hats. Children peered out from between legs. The murmur of disbelief began to swell into acknowledgement. Disbelief began to swell into acknowledgement. "Oh, 3, Mallory stepped forward, loud bravado crumbling. "You have no idea what you're stirring," he hissed. "Stay out of this." Lillian looked toward the onlookers. "This is not just about me. It's about every voice that was lost because silence was safer." She stretched her wounded ribs, breathing deep to steady her voice. "I'm not just speaking for me. I'm speaking for them." A breathless hush settled over the crowd. Then a woman, a gardener in a stained bonnet, stepped forward, voice trembling but certain. "I remember nights when he watched me too closely. I thought it was in my head." Another voice followed, then another. Soon, several dozen townspeople formed an unspoken chorus. Each small admission undid threads in Mallory's tapestry of power. Jeremiah placed his hand lightly on Lillian's back. "This is only the beginning," he whispered. Under the sunlight, the weight of silence began to break. Cedar Grove, once frozen by fear, took its first breath of courage. And in that moment, Lillian felt how recovery could fuel resolve. She had returned to the town that nearly buried her, not to crumble under guilt or fear, but to stand as a living testament to survival, truth, and collective awakening. As they stood before the courthouse, something shifted in the air, an echo of justice finding its voice. And Lillian, though fragile in body, felt unbreakable in spirit. This was no longer just personal healing. It was the spark of resistance, the beginning of a reckoning that would ripple far beyond Cedar Grove's wooden boardwalks and snow-dusted hollows. And she was ready. The courthouse square of Cedar Grove had never seen such stillness, not even in the heart of winter. The spring sun spilled a golden hush across the wooden planks and brick storefronts as townsfolk began to gather, drawn not by announcement, but by an unseen pull. Word had spread. Lillian Carter was back, not broken, not buried, but walking, speaking, and carrying truth in her hands. At her side, Jeremiah Blackwood adjusted the strap on his satchel, the weight of carefully organized evidence pressing against his shoulder. Every letter, every journal page, every blood-stained scrap of fabric, each one a thread in the story they were about to tell. But the story wasn't theirs alone anymore. It belonged to Cedar Grove. Mayor Whitcomb, flanked by the town's councilman, stood beneath the courthouse arch, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The sheriff had not arrived, not yet. But the echo of his authority still lingered in every tight-lipped glance, every folded arm. Lillian stepped forward anyway. "I know what it costs to speak when it's safer to stay silent," she said, her voice steady despite the tremble she felt inside. "But I also know the cost of silence, and I won't pay it anymore." Gasps fluttered through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Her words were more than accusation, they were invitation. An invitation to courage, to accountability. She laid the journal pages on a bench, open for all to see. Names, dates, sketches of conversations, and maps of Mayhill Ridge, the cliff where her voice had nearly been silenced forever. Jeremiah followed with testimonies from women in nearby towns, those who had suffered under Mallory's shadow but never dared speak. Until now. Then came the moment no one could avoid. Sheriff Boyd Mallory, flanked by 2 deputies, strode into the square. His spurs bit the wooden steps with a chilling precision. The crowd parted, uneasy. He stopped a few feet from Lillian. His eyes flicked toward the satchel, then back to her. "This is slander," he said coldly. "None of this holds in a court of law." Jeremiah stepped forward. "But it holds in the court of conscience," he replied. "And this town deserves that." For the first time in living memory, a murmur of assent rose, not just from the young, but from the old. Mrs. Dunley, the baker's widow, stepped from the crowd, lifting a trembling hand. "He threatened my boy last fall. Said he'd end up in the mines if I didn't stop asking questions." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "I stayed quiet, I won't again." A teenage boy followed, then a teacher, then an old rancher who once sat on the sheriff's advisory board. Voices found voices, and courage found companionship. Mallory's facade cracked. "You're turning against the very man who's kept you safe." "No," Lillian said, her gaze unwavering. "We're turning toward what's right." The mayor cleared his throat. "Effective immediately, I'm ordering an external review of the sheriff's conduct. Deputies, you are relieved pending investigation." The words dropped like thunder. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, slowly, like dawn creeping over snow, the townsfolk began to breathe again. Creeping over snow, the townsfolk began to breathe again. Oh, for children clutched their mothers' skirts, watching history unfold. Neighbors embraced in tears, some ashamed, others simply relieved. Lillian stood quietly in the center of it all, not as a victim, but as a witness to a town remembering its spine. That evening, the community gathered at the church. No sermon, no hymn, just stories, spoken into a space that had once held so much silence. Lillian didn't lead, she listened. Jeremiah sat beside her, hand lightly touching hers, as if anchoring both their hearts to the moment. By the time the stars emerged over Cedar Grove, the town had changed. Not fully, not perfectly, but undeniably. The confrontation had passed, and in its wake bloomed something fragile and rare, a community choosing truth over fear. The first gentle snowfall after the confrontation arrived not as a threat, but as a whisper of renewal. In Cedar Grove, the cold air pressed softly against Lillian Carter's cheeks as she stepped onto her porch. No cane this time, but a slow, steady stride that spoke of recovery hard won. Behind her, the world seemed more alive, more human. No longer shut tight by fear, the town's homes glowed with windows wide and welcoming. There was an energy humming beneath the surface, a sense of rebirth. Lillian paused, pressing a hand to the wooden railing. She looked across the street to the firewood pile outside Jeremiah's house. It had been stacked neatly by his own hands in the days after her return. It wasn't just wood, it was warmth, an offering made tangible. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, filled with gratitude for survival, for community, and for purpose. She thought about mornings spent in quiet conversation, Jeremiah's gentle voice telling one story after another, of tragedy turned into hope, of courage that did not require loud proclamations. They had become each other's compass, together, navigating the aftermath of fear, forging a path into something better. Today marked a turning point in their shared journey. The town hall had reopened for their monthly gatherings, informal evenings of storytelling, reflection, and mutual support. Lillian and Jeremiah had insisted these gatherings remain open to all, not framed as council or meeting, but simply a place to gather around a warm hearth and speak from the heart. She had been nervous at first. Would people come? Would they talk? But the day the door opened, she found herself nervous in a new way, excited. They arrived early to light the old fireplace and place chairs in a loose circle. Jeremiah carried blankets and tea in thermoses, warmed by a hot stove they'd borrowed from a neighbor. Lillian placed sweet rolls on a small table and paused, inhaling their faint cinnamon aroma. She thought of her scarred body, but also of her undefeated spirit. With each breath, she felt her strength returning, not in muscles, but in voice, in heart. Slowly, the front door creaked open. First came Mrs. Allen, the kindly schoolteacher who had helped Lillian through early recovery. Her eyes shone with unspoken pride. Then Mr. Whitaker, the woodworker, carefully holding the brass locket he'd given back. A few others followed, some curious, some hopeful, others carrying invisible burdens. By the fire, soft murmurs grew into friendly greetings. Lillian stood and drew a breath. This was what she had fought for. As the evening deepened, someone began a story. A farmer spoke of his fears, how he'd seen the sheriff's men on that ridge and been too frightened to ask questions. A young mother confessed tears she'd shed in secret, blaming herself for looking away. Others shared memories of Lillian's fall, not as isolated tragedy but as a symptom of collective silence. When silence fell again, all eyes turned to Lillian. She stood and walked to the center of the circle. Her voice, steady, warm, quietly determined, filled the space. "I didn't come here to be a heroine," she began. "I came here to be one of you, because change begins when ordinary people share what they carry in their hearts. Tonight is not about me. It's about us." Her words sparked quiet nods of understanding. Healing, she realized, was not performed alone. It happened in the embrace of many. After the gathering, a letter arrived. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the message unexpected. A group in a nearby mountain town had written to say they'd heard Cedar Grove's story and asked for guidance in starting similar community circles. A professor from a small liberal arts school in the city offered to help develop a curriculum on rural resilience. A young woman, halfway across the country, simply wrote, "Your courage gave me permission to speak." Lillian folded the letter carefully and placed it among the other papers on her desk. Evidence that truth, once spoken, spreads like seeds on a breeze. But her work was not finished. She and Jeremiah had agreed it was time to formalize their efforts. They began organizing a local resource network, a place where people could turn for help, guidance, or simply someone to listen. The old barn behind the schoolhouse became their first gathering space. Volunteers painted its walls bright and cheerful. Donations of blankets, coats, and food arrived. A simple bulletin board held phone numbers and comforting phrases. "Your voice matters. You are not alone. Truth connects us." One afternoon they held a line of tables. Legal aid, health resources, even a simple bread and tea stand operated by a group of older women. The turnout exceeded expectations. People came in pairs or alone, tears glistening, laughing, connecting. Lillian stood back and watched, letting warmth spread in her chest. "This is good," Jeremiah said, slipping into her side. She nodded, emotions welling. More than good. She studied their work. How slowly, but surely, they were knitting safety nets. It's a beginning. Days passed in a gentle rhythm. Lillian walked slowly through the town, past the schoolhouse, the general store, the newer resource barn. Children waved. Neighbors offered smiles, almost shy. She carried a notebook filled with ideas, mentoring programs for younger women, community hikes to build trust, writing workshops to help people express unspeakable things. The threat of Mallory's influence felt smaller now, covered by the warmth of resilience, a community that refused silence. One dawn, she climbed a short distance up Mayhill Ridge. Not to the cliff's edge, but to a vantage point where she could see the entire valley unfold. Snow dusted green rooftops and restored barns. Smoke curled from chimneys. She stood there with Jeremiah, his arm around her shoulders. "We've come so far," she whispered. He kissed her temple softly. "And there's more to come." They laid stones at that spot, a pair of stones carved with simple words, courage and care. They stood as markers of what Cedar Grove had learned. Strength is born not just in facing violence, but in choosing to heal together. Back in town, the evening of a year's anniversary came quietly. Lanterns glowed in windows, a hush of celebration. A group gathered at the square, not for a pompous ceremony, but for a simple candlelit vigil. A small stone monument rested at its heart, carved with Lillian's words, "I deserved better. We all do." Lillian stood near the monument, candle in hand. So did Jeremiah. They watched neighbors light their candles, each flame small, gentle, but resolute. In that soft light, fear yielded to connection, sorrow to solidarity. The mayor stepped forward and read the inscription aloud. Then he handed the microphone to Lillian. She spoke softly. "We came here because of pain. We stayed here because of courage. We walked through fear and we demanded more, for ourselves, for each other, for future generations. This light belongs to all of us." Tears glistened in many eyes. When she finished, the square held its breath. Then quiet applause drifted through the lantern glow. That night, Laughter returned to faces that had forgotten how to smile in public. Later, as they walked home under a gentle snowfall, Jeremiah slipped his hand into hers and whispered, "Look how far we've come." She squeezed his hand, her heart full. Yes, from falling to rising, from silence to song. In the late winter quiet, they returned to their porch. No celebration words were needed. They carried with them the warmth of shared purpose, a promise brighter than the candles still lit in windows across Cedar Grove. Because in healing her own wounds, Lillian had helped heal a town. In refusing to stay silent, she had taught others to speak, and in choosing community over fear, she had created a blueprint for rebirth. Cedar Grove was no longer hidden under snow's hush. It was alive, voices joined together, hearts bearing witness, a future shaped by courage and care. And as dawn broke on the ridge again, she and Jeremiah stood beside the candles, ready for the next chapter, to walk into more power, more advocacy, more love. Together, they would keep the light burning. Epilogue: The Fire That Never Died. Lillian Carter's journey is one of the most powerful legends ever told in the history of Cedar Grove, and perhaps the Wild West at large. What began as a horrifying act of violence on a frozen ridge evolved into a blazing testament of courage, resilience, and the unrelenting strength of one woman who refused to stay silent. Thrown from Mayhill Ridge by Sheriff Boyd Mallory after refusing his coercive offer of marriage, Lillian was meant to vanish like so many other women before her. But fate had other plans, and so did she. Saved by Jeremiah Blackwood, a solitary man with a quiet sense of justice, Lillian didn't just survive. She reclaimed her voice. From the moment she whispered her first words in Jeremiah's cabin to the day she stood defiantly before the courthouse, she transformed from victim to witness, from silence to song. This wasn't just her story. It became a mirror held up to the entire town of Cedar Grove, a town that had chosen safety over truth, and in doing so, buried countless voices beneath its snow-covered silence. But Lillian's return, her journals, her scars made visible, began to melt that frost. With Jeremiah by her side, she didn't seek vengeance. She sought visibility. She gathered proof, testimonies, truths long whispered behind closed doors, and offered them not as weapons but as beacons. She wasn't fighting just for herself, but for every woman who had been told to look away, to stay quiet, to survive without speaking. As the town listened, first in stunned silence, then in trembling solidarity, an old truth returned. A community doesn't fall because of one man's darkness. It falls when good people choose not to see. And yet, Cedar Grove chose to see. One by one, the townsfolk stepped forward. A widow, a teacher, a rancher, a child. Their voices grew stronger, braided together by Lillian's defiance. Sheriff Mallory's reign ended not with a bullet, but with truth, and that truth became the bedrock of a new beginning. In the wake of confrontation came the season of healing. Lillian didn't vanish into quiet. She stood at the center of rebirth. Alongside Jeremiah, she helped turn barns into safe havens, silence into storytelling, pain into policy. Together, they built not a monument to pain, but a movement for compassion. Lillian's candlelit vigil at the town square became a symbol, her words etched in stone. I deserved better. We all do. Those words now echo in every town meeting, in every quiet gathering around the fire, in letters sent from faraway places asking how to build the same. From the snowy banks of Mayhill Ridge to the warm hearths of new resource barns, her story traveled like wind. Quiet, steady, undeniable. It taught children how to speak truth. It taught adults how to listen. It gave permission to every silenced soul that had once asked, Will anyone believe me? Yes? Now they will. So, what's the lesson we take from this? That power, unchecked, becomes tyranny. That silence, though comfortable, becomes complicity. And that one voice, when rooted in truth and protected by community, can change everything. Lillian taught us that healing isn't soft, it's fierce. It's showing up when your body aches. It's sharing your story when your voice shakes. It's turning pain into blueprint and trauma into torchlight. Her courage didn't just rewrite her future. It gave Cedar Grove its soul back. In our world today, many still face injustice cloaked in authority. Many still walk through fear, wondering if their voice matters. If this story tells us anything, it's this: your voice is your power. And when you use it, especially for others, you don't just survive. You lead. You might not have a mountain town or a firewood pile to return to, but wherever you are, you can build community. You can light the first candle. You can say, like Lillian did, "I deserve better." And when you do, you'll find you were never alone. So, if this story moved you, if Lillian's courage reminded you of what's possible when truth finds its voice, help us keep these stories alive. Subscribe to Wild West Legends. Your support fuels the fire behind every untold story, every unsung hero, every quiet reckoning waiting to rise. Let's ride forward, together. Because legends aren't just born, they're made. Thank you for watching. Stay strong, stay brave, and never stop speaking your truth.